Check 1 2, check 1 2, walking around with a lapel mic on. Check, check. Check, check. Hopefully this sounds good coming through a lapel mic. Hopefully this sounds good coming through a shotgun mic. I'll know in a moment, I suppose. Hey everyone, I have no idea if this video is going to end up on YouTube, mostly because this is actually a very informal test, and I'm mostly testing audio equipment here. I have a set of new lapel mics that I will be using for things such as interviews, talking to people at trade shows, that type of thing. So I don't have to carry around kind of like a reporter style mic, and that's why I'm walking around. I'm testing how well this works at a distance, and when I'm certainly out of the way of something such as the shotgun mic that sits on top of my camera. The vast majority of my videos are actually shot with just a simple shotgun mic that sits right next to my camera, right on top of it, on a little shoe mount. And the reason for that really strictly just comes down to it's really easy to edit and all that. I don't have to do a lot with sound and audio. But when I do interviews, I tend to pick up that reporter mic. That way I can kind of hand it back and forth between myself and the person I'm recording. It's much more localized in terms of sound. And I don't have that shotgun mic picking up all the ambient noise. So if you look at my videos that I did for things like Dragon Con, or for videos such as the Blade show that I did back around the early summer months of last year, that's why. But I figured I'm going to talk some in my normal method, my normal way of talking, although I am walking around while I'm doing it this time. And I'm going to go off screen some as well. So you're mostly getting audio. This is really informal, and it's really just so I can see how good this audio picks up when I'm speaking at what is essentially my normal voice. But I figured if I'm going to ramble on about something, I might ramble on about something that comes to mind. I don't really have a lot of content to speak to, or a topic that is maybe something I've noticed over time, but really isn't something that's worth bringing up for an entire video, and certainly is not really worth all that much. So I'm going to grab this sword here off my wall, actually specifically to talk about this, because it's kind of an issue that I would mark as calling the windlass problem. And it's not problem in the sense of something bad. In fact, it's actually quite a positive in some ways. But it is dealing with the idea of companies that do the majority of their manufacturing out of India. And they make swords that are to certain specifications, ship them over to the US, and then people buy said products. Windlass is certainly the largest manufacturer of those types of swords and such. And I would say they're also the most successful of that model. You do have a couple of other groups. I know Depika does it, and I think there might be a few others that at least outsource a little bit. Cold Steel, you could actually say, does it, although Cold Steel really just is a remarketing in some ways of a Windlass product, because it is Windlass who is making the blades for the swords and making the overall items most of the time. I can't say all the time. I don't actually know much outside of what I have heard about the interactions between Cold Steel and Windlass. But the Windlass problem, as I would state it, is kind of an odd, multifaceted problem. And that is that they make halfway decent swords for what they are and where they are coming from. But then they miss the mark sometimes, and they miss the mark in sometimes really good ways, but sometimes really, really awful ways. So I'm just going to ramble on through some of these things as I'm walking around here and not really looking at the camera. But the problem with windlass blades is, more than anything, they aren't always historically accurate. But I don't think that's always something that's necessarily a bad thing, because you can get them cheaply. And so you can get a halfway decent sword. This one is the Windlass European sword. I actually got it for like $100, I think, at their warehouse sale. And I saw it and I was like, oh man, I need to pick that up. Because this is actually one of their better arming swords. It's very generic medieval, not really truly based on anything from a museum standpoint, but it is kind of getting all the hallmarks of a very standard cruciform arming sword, and so I picked it up. And it's exactly that. It's a great kind of munitions grade arming sword. This one they actually sharpened. You can actually see where they sharpened. I haven't done a lot to clean this up, but you can see where they sharpened. There's a very apparent secondary bevel. So that's kind of problem number one, is that a lot of times the people that are working on these kind of products to sharpen them, etc., aren't necessarily swordsmiths. There are people who work in the shop and they make these orders ready. And so they have a preset grinder they basically run these things through. I imagine they have some basic training on how to use said grinder to sharpen the blade, but it's really not going to be a sharpening that could be done really any different than if you went as a consumer and just bought a knife sharpener and kind of did the job yourself. Very apparent secondary bevel. And so that's kind of problem number one, is that when you outsource the blade making to India, or you outsource the construction of these swords, no matter how expertly it may be constructed in these kind of outsourced countries, the final product, if it comes back blunt, which they do, and then you have to sharpen them, you're never going to have the best sharpening job. It's kind of problem number one. Problem number two, in my opinion, is the much bigger problem, and so it has less to do with the resale aspect and more to do with the design and implementation. Because if there's one thing that I think I could accuse Windlass of, and this is a positive, it's as one time it was affectionately called, it's a slap and a tickle. It's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. They come up with some really interesting and very good designs. A lot of people have actually commented on this sword as an example of that. This is the Windlass Raptor. It's a fantasy scimitar-ish style sword. It's actually fairly nice for what it is. Really kind of two-handish, but really could easily be wielded one hand. Very fantasy. The construction's halfway decent, but it's nothing really to write home about, as you would say. And they make some interesting designs that are unique unto themselves, as well as doing some historical model designs. I've done videos on some of these, I say as I'm walking around again. Examples of that would probably my favorite example, I'll move this around here, is the Suantaka Viking era sword. People really get upset when you say a Viking sword. It's Viking era, it's migration period. And they did a really fantastic job at making a very nice sword. A lot of nice detailing, all of that. It's all cast, it's not necessarily historically recreated, but it is a fairly decent recreation. A lot of dust on this, I need to clean it. Fairly decent recreation of a sword for the purposes of display, and if you want to, it can be used, which is, I think that's a great advantage of something like Windlass. But a lot of times I feel like their desire to get a good sword and to execute on a really good idea is one that they get ahead of themselves in some ways. And this isn't just a problem with Windlass, this is a problem with many manufacturers, even those that don't outsource their blade manufacturing. But people get wanting to get so many designs out there that they don't ever really hone in and do a truly good job on a singular design. And even when they do, sometimes in the implementation of it can be a little bit more shoddy than you would really want it to be, and then you're ending up with a sword that could be amazing, could really be amazing. And the way I put it is that the real difference, in my opinion, besides materials, if you take materials out of the equation, the real difference between a really good, like $800 sword and a halfway decent $200 to $300 sword, the real difference in the price points there, taking materials out of the equation, is simply the practical construction and implementation of the sword. Now, I say that like if you also strip out some design elements and thought about balance and all that type of stuff, but if you had two companies that are executing on the exact same design, one company is doing it on the cheap, outsourcing to India, and the other one is manufacturing it there with very skilled labor, you're going to end up with a pretty wide difference. I hope to actually be able to, pretty soon here, really show this difference in a sword that I have purchased very cheaply, but it mimics in many ways an Albion style sword that I would hope that I could kind of do some comparisons, even though I don't have the Albion on hand to do the comparison. So I'm walking around again, sorry. This pacing is very intentional on my part. I'm trying to make sure audio stays very consistent as I move. But the real problem when you look at Albion, you look at Windlass, and you compare the two, it really just comes down to the quality of construction if you take everything else out of the equation. Because if you leave gaps in the crossguard, it can result in loosening of the hilt over time. If you use a nut pommel instead of a peen, it can have certain impacts on the quality of the blade. And how well it actually holds everything together, the compression there within. One of the reasons I'm actually a much larger fan of things such as peens over nuts. They both have their specific use cases, but I usually, generally speaking, prefer a peened blade over a nut pommel. But at the end of the day, and the reason I'm coming through all this is because Windlass always seems to draw me back in. It's the Godfather thing. I thought I got out, but they drew me right back in, right? Every once in a while they release a sword that I'm like, wow, that is so cool looking. They did such a good job with designing it. And I look at the price of the thing and I'm like, man, I might even want to buy that. But I know kind of going in that somewhere in my soul, somewhere deep in my heart, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm sitting there wishing, man, I wish this design was being made by another company. And it's not a knock against Windlass because they're executing on good designs and they're getting it to market, but it might be a little bit more shoddy because of the price point, because of how it's being put together, manufactured, and sold as a product, than it could have been. If the same design was being executed by pretty much any other company, Arms and Armor, Albion, although they only really do Peter Johnson's designs, or even you could even argue something like Dark Sword or some custom smith out there. But in terms of production line swords, it'd be really nice if some of these designs were to be in some of the other ones. Now I thought about doing a spotlight video on this sword. I'm carrying around this catalog from Museum Replicas because that's where I saw the sword on the back here. I'll throw a picture of it up on the screen. This is the Golden Coast Cutlass. I have to say it's strange. As soon as I saw this, I was like, I really want that sword because it reminds me of like two things simultaneously. It reminds me of when Pirates of the Caribbean, the movie, was really good. You remember when that was? That was when they had only one movie called The Black Pearl. And then it ceased to be, or Curse of Black Pearl, it ceased to be a good series almost immediately after that. But that first Pirates of the Caribbean movie was so good. And the design of everything, I really love the design of it. But then this sword also in some ways reminds me of another very similar movie in some ways, which is the old Peter Pan movie Hook, the one with Robin Williams. And it reminds me of it because of the golden blade on the sword and the design of it. There's something about this design. It's very interesting blend of fantasy and some realistic components. And I really only have one thing I don't like about the design of the blade, which is right there at the pommel section. I feel like it was a very lazy design to kind of go with this. Really, I think it's more like an octagonal looking pommel, and I don't know, it just looks like it got really lazy. They could have done something so much more interesting. I would have argued that maybe even the where the grip is and the pommel piece goes a little bit too far past where the grip is, almost more like a rapier design in terms of that. But at the end of the day, it's a really neat looking sword, and I kind of really want to buy it, but what's the quality of it going to be? At $200, basically $195, with all of the detailing that goes into this, it's a new design. They're doing this, what they call it, like a gold finish on the blade, antique gold finish, with all these things go on it, and then you're going to have them sharpen it, and that sharpening is probably going to mar in a really big secondary bevel. You're ending up with a slightly lesser product. And this comes back to why I call it the Windlass Problem, although, again, it can be applied to anyone, Topeka or any of these other companies. They look to get so many sword designs to market, so many, and they never execute as good as they could. And I know part of this is driven by the market that they're trying to target. They want to get people who want a real sword, but people who also don't have a big budget necessarily. But just for that couple of extra $100 with better craftsmanship, they could have a better product that a lot of people would want to buy. A company called Strong Blade does a sword. This is actually it. I really love the design of this sword a long time ago. I still kind of like it, although I think the pommel isn't nearly as good as it used to be in my eyes. This is called War Spike, but it's Strong Blade, and they designed it. And they used to just sell this like this. It's basically, I think this is just a stainless steel blade. Not really functional, not really very good for much of anything. But what's interesting about their approach to things is they actually sell the same sword with 4 different price points. And all that really changes is the quality of the build and the metals, the materials that are involved. So essentially you can go get this sword, and I might be completely wrong about this specific sword, but I know they have this kind of methodology. You can get this sword with the nut pommel like it has here, made out of stainless steel, and you get it for about $100. You can pay $150 to get the same sword made from a carbon steel nut pommel, right? Or you could spend like $200. I'm making these numbers up off my head, but $200, you can get this sword, but this time it's carbon steel that has been tempered with a nut pommel. And then for like $225, you can get the whole thing carbon steel, tempered, and peened. And so if you like the sword design, it's kind of a la carte. You buy the sword that you want in terms of the quality of the build. And I wish more companies did that. I wish Windlass did that, especially because I really, at the end of the day, I like Windlass's designs with a lot of things, but they always seem to miss the mark in terms of the quality they provide because of the price point. And so that is my just completely random thoughts on Windlass. And I have no idea how much this stream of consciousness just went all over the place, mostly because I was really concerned more about walking around my little armory here. The reason I'm testing this out as well is, to wrap this up, the reason I'm doing all the sound check and I bought this stuff, it wasn't just for interviews, although that's primarily going to be one of the reasons I use it, but also for my documentary series, because I don't want to have to be in a fixed position when I do my Historia series and sit in front of a camera about yay far away to get that audio. I'd much rather be able to walk around and you know, have nice big sweeping camera shots with me in it, and me being able to be far away and walk in the frame and all these things that would be really nice from like kind of a direction standpoint to be able to do. And this will enable me to do it. So I have no idea if anyone gets anything out of this, and if this even makes it to YouTube, it'll probably be a miracle, because I'll probably go through it, I'll be like, oh my goodness, what was I talking about? But if I actually think it's good enough, it might end up on there, and then if it does, hey, you guys got like basically a free video, because I was not planning on doing anything this weekend in terms of getting something ready and posting. I had a lot of stuff I was working on, and it was not any videos to go onto YouTube. So there you go. There are my thoughts on Windlass. This is my test of my new lapel mic. We're going to see how well it works. Till next time, guys, cheers. Have a good one.